Ambassador Kethrix of the Vorlani Collective stood at the observation window of his diplomatic vessel, watching the blue and green world grow larger as they approached. Earth. The humans called it Earth, such a simple name for a world that had caused so much confusion among the galactic community. The Vorlani had observed humans for decades before making contact. They had watched with growing concern as this species developed faster than any other in recorded galactic history. What worried the collective most was not their technology or their expansion. It was their nature. Humans were violent. Their history was written in blood. Wars, conflicts, and destruction marked every page of their development. Kethrix had been chosen for this mission because he was considered the most open-minded of the Vorlani diplomats. His people were peaceful. They had not known war for over 10,000 years. Violence was something they studied in historical texts, a curiosity from a primitive past. The idea of one being harming another was almost impossible for them to understand. Yet here he was, descending toward a planet where violence was common, where beings killed each other over resources, beliefs, and sometimes for no reason at all. The collective had debated for years whether to make contact with humans. Many argued they should be isolated, contained, kept away from the peaceful civilizations of the galaxy. But others believed that understanding was better than fear. Kethrix agreed with the second group. You could not judge a species from observation alone. You had to walk among them, talk to them, learn their ways. Only then could you truly understand what they were. The landing was smooth. Human technology had improved greatly in the years since first contact. Their ships were crude by galactic standards, but they worked. They always worked. Humans had a talent for making things function even when they should not. A delegation was waiting for him on the landing pad. Kethrix had studied human body language extensively. He could see they were nervous but trying to hide it. Their smiles were too wide, their movements too careful. They feared making a mistake. The lead diplomat stepped forward. She was a female human with dark skin and bright eyes. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she had been assigned as his guide for the duration of his visit. Ambassador Kethrix, she said, her voice warm despite her obvious tension. Welcome to Earth. We are honored to have you here. Kethrix inclined his long neck in the Vorlani gesture of greeting. His species was tall and thin, with 4 arms and skin that shifted colors based on emotion. Right now, it was a calm blue, projecting serenity and openness. Thank you, Diplomat Chen. I am eager to learn about your people. The first days of his visit were carefully managed. He was shown museums and cultural centers. He attended meetings with political leaders and scientific minds. Everything was polished, controlled, designed to present humanity in its best light. Kethrix understood this. Every species did the same when receiving important visitors. You showed your strengths, not your weaknesses, but he had not traveled across the stars to see a performance. He wanted truth. On the 5th day, he made his request. I wish to see how ordinary humans live, not your leaders or your scholars. I want to walk among your common people. Sarah hesitated. This was not in the plan. Security protocols existed for reasons, but Kethrix was insistent and his request was reasonable. How could they refuse? They chose a city called Chicago. It was large but not the largest. It had problems but was not the most dangerous. It was, the humans said, a good example of average human life. Kethrix walked the streets with Sarah and a small security team. The humans stared at him openly. Some pointed. Children asked questions that made their parents uncomfortable, but no one was hostile. Most seemed curious, even friendly. He observed many things that day. He saw humans rushing to work, stressed and tired but determined. He saw them gathering in parks, playing games and laughing together. He saw them arguing on street corners, their voices rising in passion before settling into calm again. He saw couples holding hands, families sharing meals, strangers helping each other carry heavy loads. It was not what he had expected. The violence, the chaos, the brutality he had seen in human history seemed absent. These beings were just living their lives, much like any other species he had encountered. "Your people are different than I expected," he told Sarah that evening. She smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "We have good days and bad days, Ambassador. Today was a good day." He would learn the meaning of those words soon enough. It happened on the 7th day of his visit. They were walking through a crowded marketplace when the screaming started. Kethrix's translator struggled to process the chaos of sounds, but he understood enough. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. People were running, some toward the sound, most away from it. Sarah grabbed his arm and pulled him behind a heavy stone wall. Her security team formed a barrier around them, weapons drawn. "What is happening?" Kethrix demanded. Sarah's face was pale. "There's a situation. A vehicle has crashed. There might be victims." A vehicle crash. Such things happened on many worlds. Accidents were universal, but the reaction seemed extreme for a simple crash. Then he saw the fire. A transport vehicle had struck a building and burst into flames. The structure was damaged, debris blocking the entrance. And inside, Kethrix could hear screaming. Living beings were trapped in that burning building. His skin shifted to gray, the color of distress. "We must help them." "Our emergency services are coming," Sarah said. "They'll handle it." But the screaming continued. And then Kethrix witnessed something that would change his understanding of humanity forever. A human male ran past their hiding spot. He was young, perhaps in his 3rd decade of life. He wore ordinary clothes, not the uniform of any rescue service. He was clearly not trained for this situation. Yet he ran toward the fire. "Stop him," Kethrix called out. "He will die." Sarah shook her head, her eyes fixed on the running figure. "We can't stop them. They never stop." The young human reached the burning building. Without hesitation, he plunged into the flames and smoke. Kethrix watched in horror, certain he was witnessing a suicide. No rational being would enter such danger. Seconds passed, then a minute. The fire grew worse. Emergency vehicles arrived, their sirens cutting through the chaos. Trained professionals in protective gear approached the building. And then the young human emerged. He was burned. His clothes were smoking. His skin was damaged and he was coughing violently, but in his arms he carried a small human child. He had risked his life for a stranger. Kethrix stared as medical personnel rushed forward. They treated the child first while the young man waved away their attempts to help him. He was pointing at the building, saying something Kethrix could not hear. "There are others," Sarah translated, her voice tight. "He's telling them there are more people inside." The professional rescuers moved in, but before they could stop him, another civilian ran into the building. Then another. Ordinary humans with no equipment and no training running into a burning building to save strangers. "Why?" Kethrix asked. His skin was cycling through colors he could not control. "Why are they doing this? They gain nothing. They are almost certainly going to die." Sarah looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Pride mixed with sorrow. Understanding of something he did not yet grasp. "Because someone needs help," she said simply. "That's who we are, Ambassador. That's what we do." Kethrix watched as 3 more people were pulled from the flames. One of the civilian rescuers did not come out. He had given his life for strangers he had never met. The Vorlani had no word for this. In their language, there was no concept of willing self-destruction for the benefit of others. Such an act was beyond their understanding. But as Kethrix stood in that marketplace, watching humans weep for a fallen hero, he began to suspect that everything he thought he knew about this species was wrong. The days following the fire were difficult for Kethrix. He could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed. The image of that young man running into the flames haunted him. It conflicted with everything he had been taught about humans. His species had studied human violence extensively. They had documented wars, murders, and cruelties that made other species shudder. The conclusion had seemed obvious. Humans were dangerous, unpredictable, and driven by destructive instincts. But violence for violence's sake was one thing. Violence to save others was something entirely different. Kethrix requested access to historical records of human heroism. Sarah seemed surprised by this request but granted it. For days, he read stories that left him confused and amazed. He read about humans who had hidden strangers in their homes during times of war, knowing that discovery meant death for themselves and their families. He read about rescue workers who dug through rubble for days without sleep, searching for survivors they would never meet. He read about soldiers who threw themselves on explosives to protect their companions. Again and again, he found the same pattern. Humans risking everything, giving everything for others. "I do not understand," he told Sarah one evening. They were sitting in a quiet garden at the diplomatic residence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of home. "Your species is capable of terrible violence. You have killed each other in numbers that defy comprehension, yet you are also capable of this, of sacrifice, of giving your life for strangers. How can both things be true?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She had been spending a lot of time with him, and he had come to respect her thoughtfulness. She never answered quickly. She always considered her words. "We're complicated," she finally said. "That's the simple answer. The real answer is harder. Please try." She leaned back and looked at the sky. "We have strong emotions, stronger than most species according to your own research. That means we feel love deeply. We feel loyalty. We feel empathy. When we see someone suffering, we suffer too. Saving them stops our own pain." "But you also feel hatred deeply," Kethrix pointed out. "Anger, fear." "Yes, the same intensity that makes us willing to die for strangers can also make us willing to kill them. It depends on which emotions are triggered, and by what." Kethrix considered this. Among his people, emotions were mild, manageable things. They felt affection, satisfaction, curiosity, but nothing strong enough to drive them to extreme action. "You are saying that your capacity for heroism and your capacity for violence come from the same source." "Exactly. We're not two different species, one good and one evil. We're one species capable of both extremes, and most of us spend our lives trying to choose the right one." This was a new concept for Kethrix. Among the Vorlani, there was no struggle between impulses. They simply did not have impulses strong enough to require control. The idea of constantly battling one's own nature was foreign and exhausting. "It must be very tiring," he said. Sarah laughed, and for a moment she seemed genuinely happy. "You have no idea, Ambassador, but we manage." The next week brought another lesson. Kethrix was visiting a medical facility, observing human health care. It was impressive, though primitive by galactic standards. Their understanding of biology was growing rapidly, and their dedication to healing was obvious. Then there was an emergency. A human was brought in with severe injuries from some kind of accident. The medical team worked frantically, their movements precise and desperate. "The patient has lost too much blood," one doctor announced. "We need transfusions immediately." Kethrix knew about human blood. It was complex, with different types that had to be matched carefully. Finding a donor could take time. But then something remarkable happened. Within minutes, humans began arriving at the facility. They were not doctors or nurses. They were ordinary people coming from their homes and workplaces. They came to give their blood. "What is happening?" Kethrix asked. Sarah explained. "When there's an emergency, we put out a call. People who can donate blood come to help. But they do not know the injured person." "That doesn't matter." Kethrix watched as humans sat in chairs, tubes connected to their arms, their blood flowing into bags that would save a stranger's life. They received nothing in return except a small snack and a word of thanks. "This is madness," he whispered, but he did not mean it as an insult. He meant it as wonder. Over the following days, he learned more about human sacrifice in its many forms. He learned about organ donation, where humans allowed their bodies to be used after death to save others. He learned about blood marrow transplants, painful procedures that people endured for strangers in need. He learned about parents who worked multiple jobs to give their children better lives, sacrificing their own health and happiness. He learned about caregivers who spent years tending to sick relatives, putting their own lives on hold. He learned about everyday sacrifices that no one noticed. The worker who gave up a promotion so a colleague could have it. The neighbor who shoveled snow from an elderly person's walkway. The stranger who gave their last coin to someone who seemed to need it more. "We call it humanity," Sarah told him one day. "The word means being human, but it also means showing kindness and compassion. We named our best quality after ourselves." "That seems arrogant," Kethrix observed. "Maybe, or maybe it's aspirational. We know we're capable of terrible things, but we want to believe we're capable of good things too, so we made our own name a reminder of what we should be." This perspective intrigued him. The Vorlani did not need such reminders. They simply were what they were. But humans had to choose again and again every day to be good. Perhaps that made their goodness more meaningful. The second month of his visit brought a new understanding. Kethrix asked to visit what humans called volunteer organizations. These were groups of people who worked without payment to help others. He toured a food distribution center where humans packed boxes of supplies for those who had none. He visited a construction site where humans built homes for those who could not afford them. He observed a disaster relief organization that trained people to respond to emergencies. Everywhere he went, he found the same thing. Humans giving their time, energy, and resources to help strangers. Not for payment, not for recognition, but simply because help was needed. "In the collective," he told Sarah, "the government provides for those in need. There are systems, bureaucracies, official programs. Individuals do not involve themselves in such matters." "We have those too," Sarah said, "but they're never enough, so ordinary people step up to fill the gaps." "But why you specifically? Why any particular individual?" Sarah shrugged. "Because if not me, then who? That's what we ask ourselves. Someone has to help, why shouldn't it be me?" This was perhaps the most alien concept of all. The Vorlani believed in collective responsibility, not individual obligation. No single Vorlani would feel personally responsible for a stranger's welfare. That was the job of the system. But humans seemed to feel personally responsible for everything. Every suffering creature was their problem to solve. Every injustice was their wrong to right. The weight of it must have been crushing. "Are you never overwhelmed?" Kethrix asked. Sarah's smile was tired but genuine. "Always, but that's why we work together. One person can't save the world, but one person can save one other person, and if enough of us do that." She left the thought unfinished, but Kethrix understood. Millions of individual acts of sacrifice, combined into something greater than any system could achieve. That night, Kethrix composed a message to the Vorlani collective. He wrote about what he had seen and learned. He wrote about fire and blood and tears. He wrote about a species that was simultaneously capable of the worst and best impulses in the galaxy. And he wrote a recommendation. The humans were not simply violent primitives to be contained. They were something new, something the galaxy had never seen before. They were dangerous, yes, but they were also capable of greatness. The collective needed to understand this, not to fear humanity, but to learn from them. Because if the galaxy ever faced a threat that required sacrifice, Kethrix now knew which species would run toward the flames. 4 months into his mission, Kethrix received permission to visit what humans called a war memorial. He had hesitated to request this. War was the aspect of humanity that most disturbed his people. It seemed like madness, organized violence on a massive scale. But he was beginning to understand that he could not truly know humans without understanding their relationship with conflict. The memorial was in a city called Washington. It was a simple structure, a long wall of black stone with names carved into its surface, thousands upon thousands of names. Each one represented a human who had died in a war that happened before many living humans were born. Ketherick stood before the wall, his skin shifting through shades of gray and purple. The weight of all that death pressed down on him. "Why do you remember them like this?" he asked Sarah, who had accompanied him. "Do you celebrate war?" "No," she said softly. "We mourn it. This memorial isn't about the war itself. It's about the people who died. We remember them so we never forget the cost." Ketherick moved along the wall, reading names he could not pronounce. Each one had been a living being with hopes, fears, relationships, and dreams. Each one had been cut short by violence. "They chose to fight?" he asked. "Some did, some were required to, but most believed they were protecting something important, their homes, their families, their way of life." "And were they correct?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Historians debate that. Every war is complicated, but the people who fought believed they were doing the right thing. They sacrificed everything for that belief. An elderly human approached the wall near them. He moved slowly, supported by a walking device. His face was weathered with age and pain. He stopped before a particular name and placed his hand on the stone. Ketherick watched as tears rolled down the old man's face. He stood there for a long time, his hand pressed against the wall as if trying to reach through it. "He knew this person?" Ketherick asked quietly. "Maybe, or maybe his father did, or his grandfather. These memorials connect generations. We carry the weight of their sacrifice forward." The old man turned and saw them watching. Instead of anger or embarrassment, his expression softened. "First time here?" he asked Ketherick, apparently unfazed by speaking to an alien. "Yes, I am trying to understand." The old man nodded slowly. "Took me a lifetime to understand myself. These weren't heroes or villains, just kids mostly, scared kids who went anyway because someone had to." "Why did someone have to?" Ketherick asked. "Because there are things worth fighting for, and sometimes fighting means dying." The old man looked back at the wall. "My brother's up there. He was 19, wanted to be a teacher, never got the chance. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you, but don't be sorry he died. Be glad he lived. Be glad people like him exist, ready to give everything for strangers they'll never meet." The old man walked away, leaving Ketherick with more questions than answers. That night he asked Sarah to explain human wars to him, not the politics or strategies but the human experience of them. Why did individuals fight? What drove them to face death? "Many reasons," Sarah said. "Some fight because they're ordered to, some for money or advancement. But the ones we honor, the ones we remember, fought for something bigger than themselves." "What bigger thing?" "Ideas mostly. Freedom, justice, protection of the innocent, the belief that some things are worth dying for." "Such as?" Sarah considered the question. "My grandmother lived through a terrible war when she was a child. Her country was invaded. People she loved were killed for no reason except who they were. She survived because strangers risked their lives to hide her family." Her voice grew thick with emotion. Those strangers didn't have to help. They could have looked away, stayed safe, pretended not to see. But they chose to risk everything for people they barely knew. Some of them died for their choice. "And your grandmother survived because of their sacrifice." "Yes, and I exist because of their sacrifice. And my children, if I ever have them, will exist because people who died before any of us were born decided that a little girl's life was worth more than their own safety." Ketherick sat with this knowledge. The chain of sacrifice stretching through generations, each link connected to the next. Lives saved by deaths, futures purchased with blood. "This is why you remember," he said. "Not to celebrate violence, but to honor those who gave themselves so others might live." Exactly. We build memorials so we never forget the price, and so we never pay it casually. In the following weeks, Kethrix visited more memorials. He walked through cemeteries filled with identical white stones, each marking a life cut short. He stood in museums filled with photographs of the dead, their faces frozen in eternal youth. He read letters written by soldiers to their families, full of fear and love and desperate hope. He began to understand that humans did not enjoy war. They feared it, hated it, tried everything to avoid it. But when they believed the cause was just, they would fight anyway, and die anyway. It was not madness, it was courage. One evening, he watched a human documentary about rescue workers who had responded to a great disaster. They had worked for days in toxic conditions, knowing they were damaging their own bodies. Many died years later from illnesses caused by their service. "They knew the danger," a survivor said on screen. "We all knew, but people were trapped in the rubble. How could we not try to save them?" Kethrix thought about his own people. If the Vorlani faced such a situation, they would conduct careful risk assessments. They would deploy resources efficiently. They would not send individuals into certain harm. But they also would not save as many lives. Humans rushed in because every second mattered, because someone was suffering right now and calculations could come later, because their emotions demanded action. It was inefficient, it was dangerous, it was sometimes foolish. But it was also magnificent. Kethrix began to see sacrifice not as self-destruction, but as self-transcendence. Humans who gave their lives were not throwing them away. They were using them. They were saying that some things mattered more than individual survival. This was terrifying to the Vorlani worldview. Individual survival was the foundation of everything. The self was sacred, to be protected above all else. But humans built their civilization on a different foundation. They believed the group mattered more than any one member. They believed love and duty could outweigh the instinct for self-preservation. And because they believed this, they accomplished things no other species could. They fought unwinnable battles and sometimes won them. They survived unsurvivable disasters by refusing to give up. They explored hostile environments despite the costs. They pushed boundaries that more cautious species would never approach. Humanity's willingness to sacrifice was not a flaw to be managed. It was their greatest strength. Kethrix understood now why the Vorlani collective feared humans. It was not because of their violence, their aggression, their unpredictability. It was because of their courage. The galaxy was full of ancient civilizations that had survived by being careful, cautious, and conservative. The Vorlani had endured for millennia by avoiding risk and embracing stability. But humans ran toward danger. They challenged the impossible. They sacrificed themselves for ideas and strangers and futures they would never see. They were evolution's answer to the question, what if a species cared more about others than itself? And that made them the most dangerous and the most valuable species in existence. In his 6th month on Earth, Ambassador Kethrix experienced human sacrifice in the most personal way possible. It began as an ordinary day. He was traveling with Sarah and a small security team to visit a coastal city. They were using a human aircraft, one of the atmospheric vehicles that humans used for rapid transport. Kethrix had learned to appreciate these machines. They were loud and relatively primitive, but they represented human determination to conquer their world's challenges. Humans had wanted to fly, so they invented flight. Simple as that. The flight was smooth until it was not. A sudden jolt shook the aircraft. Alarms began to sound. The crew's voices became sharp with controlled fear. "We have an engine failure," the pilot announced over the communication system, preparing for emergency landing. Kethrix felt ice spreading through his body. Emergency landing. The phrase sounded calm, but the fear in the crew's voices told the true story. Sarah was calm beside him. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "We'll be fine, Ambassador. Our pilots are well trained." But they were not fine. The aircraft shook again, more violently this time. Through his window, Kethrix could see smoke trailing from one of the engines. The ground below was water, a vast expanse of ocean with no land in sight. The next few minutes were chaos. The aircraft descended rapidly, too rapidly. The crew worked desperately to control the descent, but something was very wrong. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted. Kethrix remembered the sensation of hitting the water. The world turned upside down. Cold flooded in from somewhere. Screaming and shouting filled his ears. Then darkness. When he woke, he was in the water. The aircraft had broken apart on impact. Debris floated around him, and the smell of fuel was thick in the air. He was floating because of his life vest, a device humans had insisted he wear. He looked around frantically. Several humans were in the water with him. Some were moving, some were not. Sarah was nearby, clinging to a piece of wreckage. "Ambassador," she called out, "are you injured?" Kethrix did a quick assessment. He was bruised and frightened, but nothing seemed broken. "I am functional." But many others were not. He could see injured humans struggling in the water. Some were unconscious, kept afloat only by their vests. The rescue that should have arrived was not there yet. They were alone in the ocean. Then Kethrix watched something that would define his entire understanding of humanity. Sarah released her grip on the wreckage and began swimming toward an unconscious human floating nearby. She grabbed him and pulled him toward the debris, securing him so he would not drift away. Then she swam to another. And another. She was injured. Kethrix could see blood on her arm and her face. Every movement must have been painful. But she kept swimming, kept pulling survivors to safety, kept working when rest would have been easier. A crew member joined her. Then another survivor. Despite their own injuries and fear, they organized themselves into a rescue team. They counted heads, identified the most severely injured, and began providing care with whatever materials they could find. Kethrix watched in amazement. These beings had just experienced a terrible trauma. They were frightened, hurt, and far from help. Every instinct should have told them to preserve their own energy, to wait for rescue, to focus on themselves. But they did not. They helped each other. The rescue took hours to arrive. Kethrix later learned that their location transmitters had been damaged in the crash, making them difficult to find. For those hours, the survivors floated in the cold ocean, sustained only by each other. And in those hours, Kethrix saw more acts of sacrifice than he had witnessed in his entire career. He saw humans sharing their limited drinking water with those who needed it more. He saw them giving up their grip on floating debris so the injured could rest more securely. He saw them swimming in circles around the group, watching for dangers and keeping everyone's spirits up. One crew member, despite his own broken arm, spent hours talking to an unconscious child, keeping her head above water and monitoring her breathing. He refused rest, refused help for himself, until he was certain the child would survive. When rescue finally came, Kethrix was transported to a human medical facility. His injuries were minor, and he was released quickly, but he could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He asked to see Sarah. She was in a recovery room, her arm bandaged and her face covered in small cuts. Despite everything, she smiled when he entered. "Ambassador, I'm glad you're okay." "Because of you," Kethrix said. "You helped save many lives today." Sarah shook her head. "We all helped each other, that's what you do." But it was not what everyone did. The Vorlani would not have behaved this way. In a crisis, Each individual would have focused on their own survival, trusting the system to coordinate rescue. The idea of personally risking oneself to save strangers was not part of their nature. "I must ask you something," Kethrix said. "When you were in the water, hurt and scared, what made you start helping others?" Sarah thought about it. "I don't think it was a decision. I saw people who needed help and I helped them. That's just what you do." "That's what humans do," Kethrix corrected. "Not all species would respond this way." "Really?" Sarah seemed surprised. "What would your people do?" Kethrix hesitated. He did not want to seem judgmental, but honesty was important. "We would wait for organized rescue. We would conserve our energy and trust the system to save us. And if the system didn't come in time, then we would die waiting." Sarah absorbed this. "That sounds lonely." "It is efficient, but lonely." Kethrix had no argument. She was right. The Vorlani way was logical and efficient, but it was also cold. They would die as individuals, alone in their self-preservation. Humans died together, and because of that, more of them survived. In the weeks that followed, Kethrix completed his formal mission. He attended final meetings, wrote detailed reports, and prepared to return home. But his mind was not on diplomacy. It was on everything he had learned. He had come to Earth expecting to study a violent and primitive species. Instead, he had discovered something far more complex. Humans were capable of violence, yes, but they were also capable of love that transcended self-interest. They could hate deeply, but they could also sacrifice deeply. They were not one thing or another. They were everything all at once. On his last night on Earth, Sarah took him to a quiet beach to watch the sunset. They sat in comfortable silence as colors painted the sky. "What will you tell your people about us?" Sarah asked. Kethrix considered his answer carefully. "I will tell them that you are the most confusing species I have ever encountered, that you are capable of terrible things and wonderful things, sometimes in the same moment, that you fight and love with equal intensity." That doesn't sound like a positive review. "On the contrary," Kethrix said, "I will tell them that you are exactly what the galaxy needs. You remind us that passion has value, that caring deeply enough to sacrifice is not weakness but strength, that progress sometimes requires beings who run toward fire instead of away from it." Sarah smiled. "So you don't think we're just dangerous barbarians?" "You are definitely dangerous, but you are also magnificent. The galaxy has never seen anything like you, and I believe you will change everything. For better or worse." Kethrix looked at the setting sun, thinking of flames and blood and tears, thinking of a young man running into a burning building, of an old man crying at a memorial wall, of Sarah swimming through the ocean with a broken arm to save strangers. "For better," he said, "because you will make us better. You will teach us what it means to care enough to sacrifice, and the galaxy desperately needs that lesson." Ambassador Kethrix returned to the Vorlani homeworld 3 weeks later. His ship docked at the orbital station, and he walked down the departure ramp with a changed perspective on everything he thought he knew. The Collective's council was waiting for him. 7 elder Vorlani, their skin patterns showing curiosity and concern, sat in the traditional circle of judgment. They had received his reports, but reports could not convey the full truth. They needed to hear from him directly. "Ambassador Kethrix," the first elder began, "you have spent 1 year among the humans. Your reports have been unexpected. The council requires clarity." Kethrix took his place in the center of the circle. His skin shifted through calm blues, determined greens, and something new, something the council had never seen before. It was the color of conviction. "I will speak clearly," he said. "The humans are not what we believe them to be." "You wrote that they perform voluntary self-destruction," the second elder said. "They give their lives for strangers. This confirms our assessment of their primitive nature." "With respect, elder, it confirms the opposite." Kethrix leaned forward. We call it self-destruction because we cannot imagine choosing death, but the humans call it sacrifice, and they consider it their highest virtue. A virtue, the third elder's skin flickered with confusion. To end one's existence before natural completion is a tragedy, not a virtue. Is it? Kethrix asked. When a human runs into a burning building to save a child, they are not seeking death. They are seeking to preserve life. Their own life becomes a tool they use to achieve that goal. But they cannot know they will survive. No, and they run anyway. The council was silent. Kethrix could see them struggling to process this information. It conflicted with everything the Vorlani believed about survival and self-preservation. Let me tell you what I witnessed, Kethrix continued. He described the fire, the crash, the memorial, the hospitals, the volunteers. He told them about blood donations and organ transplants and the countless small sacrifices that made human society function. They are driven by something we do not possess, he concluded. They call it love, but that word is inadequate. It is a force that makes them value others as much as or more than themselves, and because of it, they accomplish what we never could. What do they accomplish? The fourth elder asked. Connection, community, purpose. They build their civilization not on individual survival but on mutual dependence. Each human is willing to give for the whole, and so the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. The first elder spoke again. You are suggesting we should admire this behavior. I am suggesting we should learn from it. This created a stir in the council. The Vorlani had existed for thousands of years by perfecting their ways. The idea of learning from a younger species, especially one as chaotic as humanity, was almost unthinkable. We have built a stable and peaceful civilization, the fifth elder said. We do not engage in self-destruction. We do not fight wars. We do not suffer as the humans do. That is true, Kethrix agreed. And yet we also do not progress as they do. We do not explore as they do. We do not create as they do. He paused, gathering his thoughts. In the time our species has existed, we have expanded to 6 worlds. In the fraction of that time humans have existed, they have already reached beyond their home and are spreading rapidly. They will overtake us within generations. Because of their violence, the sixth elder suggested. Because of their passion, their violence is a side effect, an unfortunate expression of the same intensity that drives their achievements. They love fiercely, and sometimes that means they fight fiercely. But without that intensity, they would never have left their world. The council debated among themselves in the formal manner of the Vorlani. Their voices were calm, their arguments logical, but Kethrix could see cracks forming in their certainty. The seventh elder, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. She was the oldest and most respected member of the council. Ambassador Kethrix, you describe a species driven by dangerous emotions. You tell us they sacrifice themselves, fight each other, and act without logical consideration. And yet you say we should learn from them. I ask you directly, what should we learn? Kethrix met her eyes. We should learn that survival is not enough. We have survived for thousands of years. We are safe, stable, and secure. But what have we accomplished? What have we created? What will we leave behind? We will leave a civilization that endures. The humans leave something more. They leave memories. They leave legacies. They leave people who remember them with love and gratitude. When a human dies after a life of service to others, their name is spoken for generations. They live on in the people they helped, the lives they touched, the world they made better. He gestured widely. When a Vorlani dies, what remains? A data file in an archive, a genetic contribution to the collective. Nothing personal, nothing individual, nothing that mattered to anyone specifically. This struck deep. The council shifted uncomfortably. The truth of his words was hard to deny. The humans have a saying, Kethrix continued. They say that a life is measured not by its length but by its impact. They would rather live briefly and brightly than long and dim. And when I stood among them, watching them give themselves for each other, I understood why. "What did you understand?" the seventh elder asked. "That meaning comes from connection. Purpose comes from caring about something beyond yourself. And the ultimate expression of that caring is the willingness to sacrifice. We have lived without sacrifice for so long that we have forgotten what it feels like to matter that much to anyone." The council session lasted for hours. Questions were asked, debates were held, and perspectives were shared. But Kethrix could see that his words were having an effect. The certainty that had defined Vorlani thinking about humans was beginning to crumble. At the end of the session, the first elder made a formal statement. "The council will consider Ambassador Kethrix's testimony and recommendations. A decision regarding human relations will be made in due course." But Kethrix knew that the real change would not come from official decisions. It would come from the questions he had planted in their minds. Questions about meaning and purpose and what it truly meant to live. In the days that followed, Kethrix was surprised by how many Vorlani approached him privately. They wanted to hear more about the humans. They wanted to understand this strange species that cared so much that they were willing to die. Young Vorlani were particularly interested. They had never questioned their society's values before, but Kethrix's accounts had sparked something in them. They began asking why the Vorlani did not form closer bonds, why their relationships were so formal and distant, why no one would sacrifice for anyone else. Kethrix answered as honestly as he could. He did not criticize his own people or praise the humans uncritically. He simply described what he had observed and let the listeners draw their own conclusions. And slowly, carefully, something began to change. Months later, the first Vorlani volunteer organizations appeared. They were small and tentative, groups of individuals who wanted to help each other outside the official systems. They were inspired by what Kethrix had described about human volunteers. A year after his return, the first Vorlani citizen gave blood to save a stranger. It was a tiny act by human standards, but for the Vorlani, it was revolutionary. One being choosing to give part of themselves for another. Change was slow. The Vorlani were not transformed overnight into a species of self-sacrificing heroes. That was not the point. The point was that they had begun to question their assumptions about what a good life looked like. And on a small blue-green world far away, humans continued to run toward fires. They continued to give blood and organs and time and energy. They continued to protect strangers and serve communities and sacrifice for causes greater than themselves. They did not know that they were teaching the galaxy a lesson. But they were. Ambassador Kethrix spent the rest of his life as a bridge between worlds. He returned to Earth many times, learning more with each visit. He watched humans at their worst and their best, and he found that he loved them for both. Because the truth was not complicated. Humans were dangerous. They were violent. They were capable of terrible things, but they were also capable of love so strong that it transcended death. They could hate deeply, but they could also sacrifice deeply. And in the end, the sacrifice mattered more than the violence. Because violence was common in the galaxy, many species fought and killed and destroyed. That was not special. But sacrifice was rare. Choosing to give yourself for others without thought of reward or survival was something the galaxy had almost never seen. The humans called it humanity. They named their best quality after themselves, as if to remind themselves what they should aspire to be. And as Kethrix had predicted, they changed everything. The galactic community learned to see humans not as threats to be contained, but as examples to be studied. Other species began to question their own values, their own purposes, their own definitions of a meaningful life. It was not a quick transformation. It took centuries, but it happened. And it all started with a young man running into a burning building. A simple act, a moment of choice, a life given for a life saved. That was the human way. That was their gift to the stars. Not technology or conquest or power. Love made manifest in action, sacrifice freely given. Humanity,